Well, we're on week 6 in our 7-week series. We're working with the book Divine Audacity by Reverend Linda Martella-Whitsitt. And this book is an update on an old Unity concept called the 12 Powers, which was developed by our co-founder Charles Fillmore. Now, I mentioned last week that the 12 Powers is Unity's system of virtue ethics. Our attempt to identify the qualities that exist in everyone that, if we cultivate them, if we focus on them, will help us to thrive and to prosper. The other thing I've mentioned before is that these 12 powers are a powerful tool for cultivating self-awareness. If we study the powers and if we look for how they show up within us, we're going to learn something about ourselves at a deeper level. We're going to learn different ways that both ourselves and humankind in general can function at the level of consciousness. And these are the aspects that we want to identify and cultivate so that we can co-create. We're trying to co-create the true, the good, and the beautiful, the world that works for all. So this is one of the paths that helps us to be able to do that. Now, today, we are working with the powers of strength and order. I mentioned last week that strength can be a little bit confusing because another one of the 12 powers is power, and they sound similar, don't they? Look up strength in the dictionary, look under synonyms, and you will find that power is synonymous with strength. Two other synonyms for strength are force and might. Now, that's not at all what Charles Fillmore had in mind when he was developing this system of virtue ethics. We're not talking about force and might when we talk about strength. Anytime we talk about force or might, we mean something that we are projecting onto the outer world in order to manipulate or change things. And the fact is that the 12 powers are always an inside job. Always an inside job. They work at the level of consciousness. So we're talking about inner strength here. So here's the definition we're working with of strength. Spiritual strength is our capacity to stand undaunted by shifting circumstances, to act courageously, and to stay the course. Now, at first, maybe that sounds as if we're being called upon to be rigid and inflexible. You know, stay the course, stand undaunted. But it's really quite the opposite. You know the old analogy about an oak tree and a willow in a windstorm? It's the tree that's able to bend and be flexible that survives the storms, to be able to bend without breaking. That's the kind of strength we're talking about here. Another good metaphor, any of you ever been whitewater rafting? When you go whitewater rafting, well, the safest course depends on exactly how the river's flowing, right? How fast it's flowing, what the water level is, all of those different things. You have a limited amount of control. Often, the shortest path is not the safest path. The whole key is to know how to go with the flow without getting swept away. That's true strength. Once we learn how to do that, how to go with the flow without getting swept away, we don't have to live in dread of what might lie waiting for us around the next bend in the river that we can't see yet. And again, that's a metaphor for life, right? Wouldn't it be great to have the skills to not have to worry about what might be around the next corner that we can't quite see beyond? We can have the confidence that we have the skill to navigate whatever awaits us by either going through it or going around it. What's wrong with that, right? Sometimes the best way to navigate the rapids is head to the shore and portage. Carry your boat around it. That works too. Some of you might recall a few years back there was a movie about Nelson Mandela called Invictus. The title comes from a poem called Invictus by William Ernest Henley, which ends with this famous verse. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. That was the poem that kept Nelson Mandela going while he was in prison. His story is really about strength. He lived in a country that had been under British and Dutch control since the 1600s. Black Africans, they were the majority, but for centuries they were controlled, dominated, and oppressed by white Europeans. And when they tried to fight back, they were routinely killed or imprisoned. Nelson Mandela tried to fight back. He ended up in prison for 27 years. Imagine that. 27 years. This is what his cell looked like. Oh, there he is. That's what his cell looked like. A mat on the floor, a bench or a table, whatever you want to call it. And of course that can over there was his toilet for 27 years. Well, toward the end he got, I guess, a few months of better treatment, but for the most part, that was his life. He could receive one piece of mail and one visitor every 6 months.
Wow.
Yeah. How generous, right? Imagine. Well, in the mid-70s, the world started changing. There was an uprising that led to international sanctions against South Africa. Remember the sanctions? Led to the repeal of the segregation laws, and Nelson Mandela was released from prison. That was in 1990. And of course, the rest of the world knew exactly what was going to happen next, right? Revenge, retribution, violence and bloodshed across the entire country as the black population had their revenge on their white oppressors. After all, what could possibly happen after hundreds of years of brutal oppression? The oppressed would rise up. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Gotta show strength, right? Don't take nothing from no one, because that's the way the rest of the world seemed to operate. Still does seem to operate. But Nelson Mandela and his supporters, many of whom were white, by the way, they had a different idea. He came from a culture that didn't believe in revenge. He believed in something that was called truth and reconciliation. Let's see if I've got this next one here. He said, as I walked out the door towards the gate, when he was released from prison, when I walked out toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison. And after 27 years, he had had enough, right? How many people here want to have for the next 4 years the kinds of worry and anxiety that you felt for the last year? Anybody want that? Hands, show of hands. Anybody want that for the next 4 years? I don't think so. I don't think so. So Nelson Mandela decided that with truth and reconciliation, they were going to transform this country. They were going to avoid this idea that revenge was going to be inevitable. They avoided the worst case scenario that many in the world thought was sure to happen. The bloodbath didn't happen. So strength doesn't depend on military might, doesn't depend on wealth, doesn't depend on social status, and it's not about tough talk. It's a measure of character, resilience, kindness, and compassion, especially in the face of oppression. Strength refuses to give in to fear or use it as a tool to manipulate others. Strength is what helps to keep us focused on the rest of our 12 powers. That's where it really is so important, because there are times when we might be tempted by outside circumstances to give up on the entire virtue ethics system of the 12 powers entirely. Strength helps us to keep focused on them. Without spiritual strength, when the going gets tough, we give up or we give in. For Nelson Mandela, think about it. It truly looked as if the forces of institutionalized racism, injustice, and oppression were not just winning, but were permanently entrenched in that country. He refused to give up. He refused to give in. And that's the kind of resolve that it takes to practice true strength, the kind of spiritual strength that we're talking about in the 12 powers. Moving on to order. And let's start with what order is not. In unity, you will hear the expression divine order. It's all in divine order, we like to say, when something goes wrong, right? When something happens that's inexplicable or unpleasant or unwell, well, it's all in divine order, right? The other way it gets misused is when we, what's the word, the technical term for it, when we screw up, right? Like when we're late for a meeting, and then when we get there, the meeting ends up starting late, so we don't get fired. Yay. Or we miss a filing deadline, and then we get an extension. Or we run out of gas, and there we are right in front of the gas station. Oh, well, it's all in divine order, right? It's like saying, okay, I was totally 100% sound asleep, but it's all going to work out. There's this God entity, apparently, that has me covered. And of course, we forget about the times when we run out of gas, not in front of a gas station, but on some backcountry road in a rainstorm, and so on and so forth. We forget about those times when the entity didn't exactly have us covered, but when it goes our way, oh, well, it's divine order, when it's not divine order. You know the old saying, if life hands you lemons, make lemonade? Well, saying divine order when we make mistakes is like saying there's this God entity out there that's going to make lemonade out of my lemons. Doesn't work that way. Getting a break is not necessarily divine order, because the reason we got ourselves in that situation in the first place is because we let ourselves drop out of what is truly divine order. We were asleep, so we dropped out of the flow of harmony. We missed something. So that's what order is not. Here's what it is. At its most basic level, divine order describes the creative process by which everything comes into existence. And this creative process has three phases: mind, idea, and expression. That's what we mean by divine order. It's also what we mean when you hear something called the creative process in unity. It's the same thing. When we look at our world, we can see that this creative process has those essential three steps or three parts: mind, or something like it, idea, and expression. That's the metaphor that we use in unity. Anything that we want to create, whether we're building a bridge or baking a cake, starts out with something akin to a thought process. Mind produces the idea that's set into motion and becomes reality. Now, instead of mind, idea, expression, we could just as easily say natural law, the operation of natural law, and then expression. Either metaphor works perfectly well. We call it divine order, but you could also call it essential order, or natural order, because we observe it. We experience it at the most basic level of our existence. We see order being made out of what appears to be chaos. From the violent expansion at the time of the Big Bang to this complex universe that we see around us that has become a thing of beauty for us, which we can appreciate and which actually sustains our lives. This is how Unity minister and author Eric Butterworth describes divine order. He says, divine order is not simply an ultimate toward which to work through some prayer technique that claims its reality. It is a fundamental truth of the universe. There is always a cosmos within every chaos. There is always enough love to go around, even within the persons involved in bitter disputes. In the flow of life, there is always the potential for peace and understanding and cooperation in every relationship. It's not something we work toward. Divine order is a present reality, a fundamental truth of the universe. If order proceeds from mind or principle to idea and expression, then it becomes really important that we're aligned with that principle, that we identify those fundamental principles and try to live in right relationship with that reality. Now, some people like to call that fundamental principle natural law. Some people like to call it divine mind, which is fine. If that's a metaphor that works for you, that's great, as long as we remember that we're not talking about some vaguely human-like mind that's floating around out there in space. We have to start at the level of mind, and we have to be very clear about what's going on there. Order is the creative process, so we got to choose very carefully what we allow our experience of mind to dwell upon. There's the old saying, I think it's in the software business, garbage in, garbage out, right? We have to watch what's going on at the level of mind. Order also tells us that we dare not try to skip a step. It's an order. It's a process. We dare not skip the step of awareness at the level of mind because the result might be something that we don't want or never intended. Order, again, means that we learn how to live in right relationship to reality. Natural law, principle, cannot be avoided or negated. Principle is always going to prevail. No matter what might be going on at the level of mind and idea, we will never negate gravity. I will never just all of a sudden float up into the air up here. It'd be kind of fun, but I don't expect that to happen. It's not going to happen. Put your hand in a flame, you'll get burned. That's the way it works. So strength and order tell us that we accept those things and we do what we can to reduce the hazards, even if we can't avoid all of them. The other important thing that order tells us is that we have some ability to direct this creative process. That means we're co-creators. That's what we mean when we use that term, co-creators. We have some ability to direct the creative process. We have the ability to guide the evolution of human consciousness. And this evolution tends to be adaptive. That's how evolution works. It works towards that which is adaptive and helps those traits and practices to survive. And we can direct this practice to some extent, and of course one of the ways that we can always help direct this process is to nudge it towards bringing more peace, more goodness, and more harmony into being through us. Those things have proved to be adaptive. It's about growth, it's about transformation to a greater realization of our power when it comes to that process. Now I know it's easy to look around at the things that are going on in the world and we wonder, is it really true? Is there more peace and goodness and harmony? Are those things really adaptive? Anyone ever get to the point where you don't want to watch the news or read the paper? Well, spiritual growth is not always neat and pretty, but it is happening. Human beings today are at a greater, more evolved level of consciousness than human beings were 2,000 years ago. And people in that era were at a different level from people 2,000 years before that. And on it will go. That's divine order. That's the process. Sometimes we just need something to push against, right? That irritating grain of sand that helps the oyster produce a pearl. Human beings are free to resist the evolutionary impulse. That impulse that helps us to move forward. We can cooperate with it or we can fight it. We can move backwards, and the result is what we call chaos. But so long as there is life on this planet, divine order will always prevail eventually. And all of history shows us that. History shows us that which we call evil collapses under its own dead weight. It may seem to have a toehold, but in reality, evil is a parasite. It comes into existence through human fear, ignorance, and indifference. And then, like a parasite, it feeds on those things. Charles Fillmore came up with that parasite metaphor, and he said it like this. He said, evil is a parasite. It has no permanent life of itself. Its whole existence depends on the life it borrows from its parent. The way you get rid of a parasite is you stop feeding it. Trust in order. A thing left unfed will wither and die. Refuse to feed the parasite at the level of consciousness, and you will see that it is short-lived. But you have to combine the power of strength with that affirmation of order, and with patience and the kind of perseverance like Mandela, we are assured that order and justice will prevail. Next week, our last installment, Release and Life, and a potluck, and another color to wear. See you then.